Hello and welcome to Pensions in 10 with me, David Brooks, and my colleague Simon Kew. This week we look at DB surpluses again. We talk about the triple lock, probably again, and also auto-enrolment again. Anyway, enjoy.
Well, Dave, it's that time again when DB surpluses are in the news. So what specifically are they in the news for this time?
Yeah, this feels a little bit like Déjà vu. Rachel Reeves is apparently going to, this is all press reports, but is apparently going to be speaking on Wednesday. And in that speech, she is going to mention her desire to access the surpluses that have now appeared in defined benefit pension schemes over recent years, where the funding has improved. And yet the direction of travel still remains for many schemes into buyout. And that is not, as we know, the wishes of the government. They would much rather those assets are used in productive finance. And so Rishi Sunak's government did start this conversation with a consultation last year, around February. I think it closed in the middle of April, but then obviously we had the election in July. So that didn't go anywhere, but that did talk about how the law could be changed to allow surplus sharing with employers. And obviously the goal behind that is to make employers perhaps slightly more keen to invest in riskier assets rather than locking everything down with gilts, and so that any future positive returns could then be easily paid back to the employer. And the conversation that's been buzzing around the industry for the last few years as well of run-on rather than buyout becomes more interesting for the employer, because then the DB scheme becomes an asset, and an asset that is, albeit the investments are illiquid, the assets can be accessed while not having to wind up the pension scheme, and so the scheme can keep running on, and the employer can take some positives out. Obviously, they also reduce the corporation tax on refunds from 35% to 25% as well. So that's sort of what we're going to hear about. One of the big issues will be how member security works, because obviously if you start taking money out of pension schemes, that could potentially reduce the security of members, and that's ultimately what trustees would be most concerned with if they're talking about this with their employer. And so allowing either some sort of upside sharing with employers with members, or at least protecting the funding so that members' actual ultimate benefit security isn't compromised, will be central to these conversations. It also brings back the possibility of the public sector consolidator, where this run-on, it will be, the larger the scheme, the more interesting it will be. But for smaller schemes that don't have those economies of scale or the size of assets that necessarily would be useful or able to be invested in productive finance in any meaningful way, then the public sector consolidator idea comes back, and perhaps that's where some smaller schemes should head, and that way then the government could have some influence over the investment strategy, and then that arrangement can invest in productive finance. So all those things that we talked about probably around about this time last year are potentially back on the menu again. So Simon, you're looking well rested. I think that's probably because of your bedtime reading, which is Hansard. And I know you've been digging into the House of Lords episodes of Hansard or chapters of Hansard in the last few days, and you spotted something about the triple lock. Can you tell us what that was?
I can, yes, and I certainly recommend it. Anyone struggling with insomnia, dig out Hansard. It's a ripping yarn. Triple lock. Rest easy, everybody. We're back where we were. The current government said that they would stand by the triple lock during this Parliament, and they've underlined that. And that was from Baroness Sherlock in the Lords. There was a question put to her about the commitment to the triple lock, given the new pension minister's previous views. So Torsten Bell, when CEO of the Resolution Foundation, referred to the triple lock as messy and rubbish, and called for a replacement. So I think it was Lord Dodds maybe being slightly mischievous in asking the question. But Lady Sherlock said, "Our commitment to the triple lock for the entirety of this Parliament means that spending on people's state pensions is forecast to rise by over £31 billion. As a result, the yearly state pension will have increased by up to £1,900 by the end of the Parliament." And she confirmed that she and the Minister for Pensions, Torsten Bell, are equally committed to standing by that promise. So pensioners, stand down. The triple lock's here till the end of the Parliament. Dave, my dear chap, we now move to the world of auto-enrolment, and I'm sure our viewer and listener are champing at the bit and clawing at the computer, waiting to hear what's happened. So what has happened?
Yeah, nothing, as usual. No, so auto-enrollment, yeah, we have these, there's a trigger for when someone can be auto-enrolled, and then there's upper and lower earnings thresholds from which contributions are deducted, and they are all the same. And they've been the same for about 5 years now, so I won't rehearse the numbers for you. So it's been met by the whole industry really with a sort of a sigh of resignment, I suppose, of, well, we were expecting that. You will hear and read in reports on this around a 2017 review, which suggested increases to those and changes to those triggers, and they still haven't happened, and nobody was expecting anything dramatic to happen this time. So no great surprise. There are good news, I suppose, in the status quo, in that as earnings rise, people will contribute more people will fall into scope to be auto-enrolled, and they're estimating around 90 billion will be going to pension schemes this year. So it's still a big number, and there's still a lot of money going into pensions, and so that's still good. And they'll obviously talk about how that can be improved.
And it's, as you say, Dave, it's absolutely no shock, particularly, I think, because part 2 of the pensions review has been delayed till, well, later this year, probably. So they're not going to make any big changes to auto-enrolment contributions as a result of that alone, I would suggest. So anyway, talking of the part 2 of the pensions review and adequacy and things like that, you spotted something else, haven't you?
Yeah, there's some interesting statistics coming out around opt-out rates from auto-enrolment, and one stood out in particular around the higher than average rates around Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities, which is notable. And so some analysis of that has sort of highlighted that perhaps these are based on Islamic and religious grounds of people wanting to opt out because they don't have the access to a Sharia fund. And this has come up in our discussions around part 1 of the review around mega funds and DC pension schemes having fewer providers and fewer default funds. And one of the unintended consequences, perhaps, of having fewer default funds is we may see that there might be less flexibility in the default funds that providers will offer. And Sharia has been noted as being perhaps a casualty of this. And if people don't have the access to retirement options and investment options that that comply with their views and beliefs, then that's going to be an issue, and those numbers will only go up, and that's not what we want. We want people to be able to save for retirement, independent of whatever their beliefs might be. So that, I think the government do need to think carefully about having a broad brush approach and what those consequences might mean, because it'll only mean having to water them down again later on. So let's make sure that they're considered fully and properly during these consultation phases. We made a point in our consultation response around this, so hopefully the government do make sure they think about that. And also there was another story around pensions and some stats around what's happening in sort of society and how pensions and savings interact. And the news that I think these are standard life figures. I'm pretty sure they are standard life figures. The average age of a first-time buyer is now 34 in the UK, and also in that same analysis, they were saying that people don't really start thinking about their pension contributions until they get to age 50. And I think this needs to be part of that. You were talking about part 2 of the review. That does need to be an acknowledgement in part 2 of the review into adequacy in pensions. Acknowledge that people do have different priorities at different stages of their lives. Up to 34, it's obviously going to be saving for a deposit, so you can actually buy somewhere to live. 34 onwards until 50, it's families and children, which will be taking away that excess income anyone has. And then 50 onwards is when children will be a bit older, perhaps less reliant on their parents, hopefully. God, one day. I know, but statistically, it's probably more likely they'll have excess income now to save in their pension, and it's understandable. And I think any adequacy analysis that the government do later on this year needs to acknowledge these different priorities at different times. And while I will sing about how great pensions are from the rooftops, we do have to acknowledge that pensions aren't everything to everybody all of the time. And I still think one of the easiest things they could do is decouple employer and employee pension contributions. And if employers pay in throughout people's lives and employees can dip in and out as and when they have different needs, then I think that should be something that the government considers implementing.
Well, dear viewer and listener, it's time for us to exit stage left, pursued by a bear. Hopefully not actually pursued by a bear. Thank you very much for listening to Pensions in 10 this week. We hope you enjoyed it. Thanks as ever for feedback, comments that we get. We do absolutely love to hear from you. In the meantime, have a fantastic week. Keep pensioning, and we'll see you on Pensions in 10 next week.